Alright, today I'm going to read Flaws in the Coronavirus Pandemic Theory by David Crowe. I'm going to read excerpts of this, not the whole thing. Executive Summary. The world is suffering from a massive delusion based on the belief that a test for RNA is a test for a deadly new virus, a virus that has emerged from wild bats or other animals in China, supported by the Western assumption that Chinese people will eat anything that moves. If the virus exists, then it should be possible to purify viral particles. From these particles, RNA can be extracted and should match the RNA used in the test. Until this is done, it is possible that the RNA comes from another source, which could be the cells of the patient, bacteria, fungi, etc. There might be an association with elevated levels of RNA in this illness, but that is not proof that the RNA is from a virus. Without purification and characterization of virus particles, it cannot be accepted that an RNA test is proof that a virus is present. Definitions of important diseases are surprisingly loose and perhaps embarrassingly so. A couple of symptoms may be contact with a previous patient, and a test of unknown accuracy is all you often need. While the definition of SARS, an earlier coronavirus panic, was self-limiting, the definition of COVID-19 disease is open-ended, allowing the imaginary epidemic to grow. Putting aside the existence of the virus, if the COVID-19 test has a problem with false positives, as all biological tests do, then testing an uninfected population will produce only false positive tests, and the definition of the disease will allow the epidemic to go on forever. This strange new disease, officially named COVID-19, has none of its own symptoms. Fever and cough, previously blamed on uncountable viruses and bacteria, as well as environmental contaminants, are most common, as well as abnormal lung images, despite those being found in healthy people. Yet, despite the fact that only a minority of people tested will test positive, often less than 5%, it is assumed that this disease is easily recognized. If that was truly the case, the majority of people selected for testing by doctors should be positive. The COVID-19 test is based on PCR, a DNA manufacturing technique. When used as a test, it does not produce a positive-negative result, but simply the number of cycles required to detect sufficient material to beat the arbitrary cutoff between positive and negative. If positive means infected and negative means uninfected, then there are cases of people going from infected to uninfected and back to infected again in a couple of days. A lot of people say it is better to be safe than sorry, but that some people are quarantined who are uninfected than risk a pandemic. But once people are test positive, they are likely to be treated with treatments similar to SARS. Doctors faced with what they believe is a deadly virus treat for the future for anticipated symptoms, not for what they see today. This leads to the use of invasive oxygenation, high-dose corticosteroids, antiviral drugs, and more. In this case, some population of those diagnosed in China are older and sicker than the general population and much less able to withstand aggressive treatment. After the SARS panic had subsided, doctors reviewed the evidence, and it showed that these treatments were often ineffective and all had serious side effects, such as persistent neurologic deficit, joint replacements, scarring, pain, and liver disease, as well as higher mortality. The COVID-19 scare that emanated from Wuhan, China in December of 2019 is an epidemic of testing, as the graph below with test statistics from Austria shows. There is no proof that a virus is being detected by the test, and there is absolutely no concern about whether there are a significant number of false positives on the test. What is being published in medical journals is not science. Every paper has the goal of enhancing the panic by interpreting the data only in ways that benefit the viral theory, even when the data is confusing or contradictory. In other words, the medical papers are propaganda. It is also an epidemic by definition. The definition, which assumes perfection from the test, does not have the safety valve that the definition of SARS did. Thus, the scare can go on until public health officials change the definition or realize that the test is not reliable. SARS, according to CDC, required a respiratory symptom, close contact with another SARS case or traveled to a designated epidemic area, and a positive SARS test or lack of antibodies believed to be protective. Once everyone had been quarantined, the second criterion was difficult to achieve outside of a hospital, and numbers plummeted. What I learned from studying SARS, the previous big coronavirus scare after the 2003 epidemic, was that nobody had proved the coronavirus existed, let alone was pathogenic. There was evidence against transmission, and afterwards, negative assessments of the extreme treatments that patients were subjected to: the nucleoside analog antiviral drug ribavirin, high-dose corticosteroids, invasive respiratory assistance, and sometimes Tamiflu. This is documented in my book draft chapter, mostly complete, that you can find here. Virus existence. This is the important chapter for me, or the important section number 3 right here. Scientists are detecting novel RNA in multiple patients with influenza or pneumonia-like conditions, and are assuming that the detection of RNA, which is believed to be wrapped in proteins to form an RNA virus, as coronavirus are believed to be, is equivalent to isolation of the virus. It is not, and one of the groups of scientists was honest enough to admit this. We did not perform tests for detecting infectious virus in the blood. But, despite this admission, earlier in the paper they repeatedly referred to the 41 cases out of 59 similar cases that tested positive for this RNA as, quote, 41 patients confirmed to be infected with 2019 NCOV. Another paper quietly admitted that our study does not fulfill Koch's postulates. Source number 1. Koch's postulates, first stated by the great German bacteriologist Robert Koch in the late 1800s, are simple logic and can be stated as: purify the pathogen from the virus from many cases with a particular illness, expose susceptible animals, obviously not humans, to the pathogen, verify that the same illness is produced. Some add that you should also repurify the pathogen just to be sure that it is really creating the illness. Famous virologist Thomas Rivers stated in a 1936 speech that it is obvious that Koch's postulates have not been satisfied in viral diseases. That was a long time ago, but the problem continues. None of the papers referenced in this article have even attempted to purify the virus, and the word isolation has been so debased by virologists that it means nothing, adding impure particles to a cell culture and seeing cell death as, quote, isolation. Source number 1 did publish electron micrographs, but it can clearly be seen in the lesser magnified photo that the particles believed to be COVID-19 are not purified, as the quantity of material that is cellular is much greater. The paper notes that the photos are from human airway epithelial cells. Also consider that the photo included in the article will certainly be the, quote, best photo, i.e., the one with the greatest number of particles. Lab technicians may be encouraged to spend hours to look around to find the most photogenic image, the one that looks like pure virus. There is no way to tell that the RNA being used in the COVID-19 test is found in those particles seen in the electron micrograph, because you cannot see what the contents are. They could be protein, RNA, or DNA. Thus, there is no connection between the test and the particles, and no proof that the particles are viral. A similar situation was revealed in March 1997 concerning HIV, when 2 papers published in the same issue in the journal Virology revealed that the vast majority of what had been previously called pure HIV was impurities, that they were clearly not HIV, and the mixture also included microvesicles that look very similar to HIV under an electron microscope but are of cellular origin. Alright, I'm going to skip that one. A new disease? COVID-19 is described as a distinct new disease, but it is clearly not. There are no distinctive symptoms for a start. Reference 2 showed that among the 41 early cases, the only symptoms found in more than half were fever, cough, and 98% had CT scan imaging showing problems in both lungs, although it is possible to have shadowing on a CT scan without symptoms. The high percentage of cases with the fever and shadowing in both lungs is an artifact of disease definition. Fever and radiographic evidence of pneumonia are two of the diagnostic criteria for a probable case. The low rate of people testing positive on the COVID-19 test is further evidence that there are no obvious symptoms. If there were recognizable symptoms, doctors should have a better than 3 to 5% chance of guessing who has the virus. While some of the people may have been tested without symptoms because they were on a flight or a cruise, countries outside China are encouraging people with the non-specific symptoms of fever and cough to get tested. So increasingly, people have symptoms of the flu or pneumonia but are still testing negative in high numbers. Number 5, testing. I'm just going to read bullet point number 2 here. We don't know the false positive rate of the test without widespread testing of healthy people far from places where people are being diagnosed with this possible new disease. If the test is 99% accurate in a city of over 10 million, like Wuhan, there would be about 100,000 false positives. It is easy to generate a false epidemic if you keep testing like this, and it is worse if you restrict the test to people with symptoms, because then the flaws in the test will not be revealed for longer. Testing at such an early stage of knowledge is incredibly dangerous. It spreads panic, it can put people on dangerous medications. Other circumstances of their treatment can be physically and psychologically damaging, such as intubation and isolation, and even seeing all the doctors and nurses in special suits emphasizing how deathly sick you are. Okay, the test is not binary. Tests for infections are usually reported as positive or negative, sometimes reactive and unreactive. One of the reasons for this is that in many cases multiple tests are required, and it is common to conclude that someone is infected even with some negative tests, and that someone is uninfected even with some positive tests. The results of a complex multi-test algorithm are also usually reported as positive or negative, but interpreted by doctors and patients as infected or uninfected. The former could mean isolation, special medications, special precautions for healthcare workers, and more. But in reality, even individual tests are not binary, not positive or negative, but a range of numbers that are arbitrarily divided into positive on one side and negative on the other. Possibly there is a gray area that allows other factors, including the bias of the doctor or laboratory, to enter into the interpretation, or that will require further testing. Before we continue, it is important to understand what RT-PCR, the test technology, is. It is based on PCR, polymerase chain reaction, a DNA manufacturing technique invented by the iconoclastic Kary Mullis, who received a chemistry Nobel for it in 1993. It is one of the most important technologies invented since the rise of biotech industry in the 80s. Starting with one DNA strand, the strand is cleaved, split into two, and then complementary strands are allowed to grow, the same process that occurs in a cell during mitosis. So far, not so impressive, but through the magic of doubling, if this process is repeated 10 times, you will have about 1,000 identical strands of DNA, 20 times a million, 30 times a billion, 40 times a trillion. Each round of doubling is referred to as a cycle. To use or abuse PCR as a test, you assume that you are starting with an unknown number of strands and end up with an exponential multiple after n cycles. From the quantity of materials at termination, the starting quantity can be estimated. A major problem with this is that because PCR is an exponential doubling process, errors also grow exponentially. In reality, the starting quantity is often not estimated, but the optical density or another characteristic of the growing pile of DNA can be determined. Another problem with many viruses, like coronavirus, is that they are believed to be composed of RNA, but this can be solved by converting all RNA into DNA with the reverse transcriptase enzyme at the start of the process. The technology after these two adaptations is known as the Pcr Rst Pcr Test. Now you have the information necessary to understand the numbers from 20 to 40 on the vertical axis of the graphs above. These are the number of cycles, and implies that it always took at least 20 PCR cycles before any RNA could be detected, and they stopped after a maximum of 37 cycles. The blue line is at cycle 38, and the black dots do not mean RNA was detected after 38 cycles, as clarified in the paper, but that it wasn't detected by 37 cycles, so the process terminated. This serial cycle threshold was the arbitrary definition of a negative result by the authors of reference. We can see that it was arbitrary because in another paper, reference 13, the authors had two endpoints, 37 and 40. Anything less than 37 was considered positive, and anything 40 or greater was defined as negative. The in-between values of 38 and 39 resulted in retesting. Note that this paper would treat 37 as indeterminate, but the Singapore paper would treat it as positive. In a review of 33 tests approved by the FDA under emergency conditions, where a PCR cycle number cutoff was recommended, it varied widely. One manufacturer each recommended 30 cycles, 31, 35, 36, and so on. Among other problems, background fluorescence will build up and can produce false positives with enough cycles. Being arbitrary is not the only problem with the use of the cycle number. The values are not comparable between labs and will vary within a lab, even if minor changes in the process are made, such as using clear plastic tubes instead of white plastic. So here we can see that the test is not a simple yes or no, you are infected. That's what I wanted to show here. I'm going to skip the transmission section. Treatment for the putative novel coronavirus COVID-19 is following the same pattern as for SARS. Apart from standard treatment for respiratory conditions, there is a tendency towards providing oxygen to patients more aggressively, intubation, the use of high-dose corticosteroids, and a variety of antiviral medications. This did not work out well for SARS, as a report commissioned by a WHO expert panel after SARS was over said, despite an extensive literature reporting on SARS treatment, it was not possible to determine whether treatments benefit patients during the SARS outbreak. Some may even have been harmful. Some may have been harmful. Of patients treated with ribavirin, 49 out of 138 to 67 out of 110 developed hemolytic anemia, a recognized complication with this drug. Although it is not possible to rule out the possibility that SARS-CoV infection caused the hemolytic anemia, there is also no control group. One study noted that over 29% of SARS patients had some degree of liver dysfunction, indicated by ALT levels higher than normal, and the number of patients with this complication increased over 75% after ribavirin treatment. In the Chinese literature, we found 14 reports in which steroids were used. 12 studies were inconclusive and 2 showed possible harm. One study reported diabetes onset with methylprednisolone treatment. Another study, an uncontrolled retrospective study of 40 SARS patients, reported avascular necrosis and osteoporosis among corticosteroid-treated SARS patients, which resulted in many joint replacements, particularly in Hong Kong. So yeah, now we have a bunch of unproven therapies being used on people that are already compromised, people being injured by drugs, is basically what we're seeing here. These drugs are sometimes described as experimental, but that is a misnomer and disguises the fact that they are not used in the context of science. It is clearly not science when there is no placebo, no blinding, and no randomization. It is likely that sicker patients will be prescribed untested drugs, and if they have a health decline, it will be blamed on the virus. And nobody could know what would have happened if they had received standard medical treatment for their symptoms. At best, there will be a comparison between two unproven drugs. If the patient survives, it will likely be considered a success and is worth millions or more in public relations to the drug company. And as you can see here, 93% of the 41 confirmed Chinese COVID-19 cases received Tamiflu and future use of drugs. 75 of 99 patients also in China received unspecified antivirals. 52% of the COVID-19 positive people who died in Italy were also put on antivirals. Goes to the dangers of invasive ventilation. Conclusions. In the following section on treatment, it is shown that coronavirus-positive patients who die are generally older and sicker than the general population. This means that they are less able to withstand aggressive treatment. It is not known that the treatments have side effects, that these can be quite severe, but it is not yet known if any of them have benefits. A report from New York showed that 88% of the 5,700 COVID-19 patients had more than one pre-existing health condition, several of which are often associated with difficulty breathing, morbid obesity, asthma, COPD. Many people noted that both Wuhan and Lombardy, Italy, two hotspots for coronavirus deaths, also suffered from heavy air pollution. And I would also like to note that New York, since everyone who was living there in 2001, a certain event, all breathed in some horrible material. So that could be the reason we see higher problems there. It's the horrible air quality from a certain day in 2001. The coronavirus panic is just that, an irrational panic based on an unproven RNA test that has never been connected to a virus, and which won't be connected to a virus unless the virus is purified. Furthermore, even if the test can detect a novel virus, the presence of a virus is not proof that it is cause of the severe symptoms that some people who test positive experience, but not all who test positive. Finally, even if the test can detect a virus and it is dangerous, we do not know what the rate of false positives is. And even a 1% false positive could produce 100,000 false positive results just in a city the size of Wuhan, and could mean that a significant fraction of the positive test results being found are false positives. The use of powerful drugs because doctors are convinced that they have a particularly potent virus on their hands, especially in older people with pre-existing conditions, is likely to lead to many deaths. Yes, more iatrogenic deaths because of the aggressive pharmacology treatment. There's very little science happening. There's a rush to explain everything that is happening in a way that does not question the viral paradigm, does not question the meaningfulness of test results, and that promotes the use of untested antiviral drugs. And given enough time, there will be a vaccine developed, and for some of the traumatized countries, it may become mandatory, even if developed after the epidemic has disappeared, so that proving that it reduces the risk of developing a positive test will be impossible.